So what is the best Michael Moorcock series to recommend? Hey guys, what's up? How you doing? So what is the best Michael Moorcock series to recommend? If you guys have already read Michael Moorcock's book or books or series, his series of books, because basically he's an author. And if you've read any of those, maybe you've read a lot of them, maybe you've just heard of Michael Moorcock, you've read a couple of his things. He has other writings besides his fantasy writings and stuff like that. So he's really a well-known author, especially in England, where he's a lot more well-known than other parts of the world. But he's mostly known for his Elric Saga, Elric of Melniboné, which is the one he's known for. But there's lots of other series that he does that are really good and worth mentioning. So the best ones, I would say, Michael Elric of Melniboné is probably one of his best series, and it's the one that he's known for. It's a high fantasy adventure story about a emperor who pretty much doesn't want to be an emperor and lets the usurper take over the throne. And instead he goes out and ventures forth into the world that he lives, like the fantasy world, and travels from place to place and meets like creatures and people and parts of himself, that are like other incarnations of who he is. He's basically a a internal champion, an incarnation of the eternal champion. The eternal champion is sort of like this being who's always destined to fight all the time. Even though he wins most of the time, he's still destined to fight all the time, and he doesn't like it because it's just his destiny to constantly be in battle and combat and all the time. It's always some kind of combat. He's some kind of eternal champion. And so he meets other parts of himself and he meets other characters, and it's very interesting and really good. There's creatures and there's like deities and monsters. There's wizards. There's magical spells and like rune swords. Like he has this like really powerful rune sword that pretty much is more powerful than anything else, and that it's the only thing that makes him powerful. Other than that, he's not really a powerful person. He's just like, he's kind of weak and frail, and he really relies on the sword to give him energy. The sword kind of lives through him because the sword needs somebody to wield it, and the sword is alive. So, and without Elric, the sword kind of wouldn't be inactive. So the sword needs Elric. So the sword is like loyal to Elric, and basically like just goes around, just kind of like basically eating people, eating their souls and stuff like that. So that is the one that he's mostly known for, but there's like a lot of other stuff that is really good. And there's a lot of other stuff that he wrote. Like there's other stories. There's one that's just a series of a few books. Elric has a bunch of books. I don't know, I'm gonna guess around 10 or something like that. There's a lot of different books. And then there's like more with Elric, and it goes on to different series that I'm not sure are still Elric, or maybe they're like something a little bit different. But classic Elric of Melniboné is about 7 to 10. I think there's more that he wrote. Some of them might be more about Elric or less about Elric, but they're just more stories sort of like about that. So also, what I found was even a little bit better than Elric stories was the Eternal Champion stories. There's stories about just the Eternal Champion. One of them is named Ericos. I believe that's one of the Eternal Champions. And basically, it's like a single book, and it's not really a series, because like Elric of Melniboné or the Elric Saga is a series of books. It's like 7 to 10, how many ever he wrote. But he wrote some single books, and his books are they're page turners, and they're really easy to read because they're small little paperbacks, and they're only like 200 pages each. So you're not going to have those like giant 500-page paperbacks that are like heavy to take with you. You can just put them in your pocket and read them on the go wherever you're going. And they're real easy to read, and when you read one, you always want to read another one. So all of these they're kind of similar. Like, Elric is the same as the Eternal Champion series because there's the same kind of idea. It's high fantasy. It's swords, it's wizards, it's magic, it's monsters and dragons and things like that. And like fantasy realms and going through dimensions and stuff like that. But the stories are really, really good. They're well told, and you kind of like really gets like kind of like immersed in them. You really get sucked into them. So if you guys have read Elric of Manibelne or the Elric Saga, or heard about it, or maybe read some of the Elric Saga, check out another one called the Eternal Champion Saga. And it's not like a Eternal Champion Saga. It's like it's stories about the Eternal Champion, and then there are different stories about different people, but the person is only an incarnation of the Eternal Champion. He's just a person who's the he's the Eternal Champion, but there's other people who are also the same person, the Eternal Champion, but they're different actual people, which is really, really interesting how he does that. So you can have like lots of different characters, but they're all really the same person. Like somehow they're the same person. So it's real interesting how they live in different dimensions and different lands and stuff like that, but they're like the same actual person, the incarnation of just an incarnation of the Eternal Champion. So those are really good. Just the stories that are just about the Eternal Champion, those are really, really good. They're sort of similar to the Elric Adventures, but they're different. They're a little bit, I like how they're written more, and I like how they're faster stories, because Elric is a long story that you have to read through. These stories are short. It's like a 200-page story, and it's from beginning to end, and that's it. And that's all he writes about that one character. And then there's like another book also about like an incarnation of this character, but also like, from beginning to end. So it's one story, one character, one thing. It starts and it ends, and that's it. So those are really, really cool. So those are the two ones that I think are worth mentioning the most. And there's some other ones that are really, really cool. There's also a rune staff series, not just the rune sword, which is like the Elric kind of has his sword is the rune sword. So he's kind of the rune sword series. There's the rune staff series, which is really, really cool. The rune staff series is a different character, a different story, a different world. The rune staff is similar to the rune sword. The heroes in that story are similar to the Elric story heroes and the Eternal Champion heroes, but it's the same author doing like different characters in different worlds. So they're similar because it's the same author telling a different story. But what's cool is this story can be told so many different ways, on so many different levels, and so many different worlds, with so many different main characters and supporting characters and adventures, that I like the fact that he diversifies it and makes a rune sword series, then a rune staff series, and then an Eternal Champion series, and like these different characters that change the story up enough to make it an original new story. But what's the same is the really, really good writing and the fantasy world and the fantasy story that he's telling, and Moorcock is telling. So the Rune Staff series is really, really good also. It's a little bit shorter than the Elric saga, but really, really cool, really worth reading. And there's also like the story's different. I didn't read the whole thing yet. The story's different. There's like different elements of it. There's different, there's like a rune staff. There's different, magical elements. There's different deities, and there's different like heroes and villains, and the stories are different and the worlds are different. So that one's also really good, really, really worth the read. There's the Chronicles of Quorum. The Chronicles of Quorum are really good. I just found it to be a little bit like, I found it to be more violent than the other stories. Like, I thought the Elric story, like, there'd be violence in the story. It's a sword and sorcery story. There's violence, but this one had a lot more violence in it. So it's a little bit more difficult to read because of the violence, in my opinion. But it's also considered one of his best series, and this is the Chronicles of Quorum. There's like 6 books in that series. There's like the first 3, and then there's the second 3. And those are really, really considered, like, people love that story. The people that have read the whole thing, they feel like that this is also one of Michael Moorcock's best stories. So there's that one. There's one called The Metatemporal Detective, which is a character called Jerry Cornelius. And this is it's not like, those were the high fantasy sword and sorcery stories, basically. Jerry Cornelius is where Michael Moorcock changes kind of like direction a little bit, and Jerry Cornelius is a different character, and it's fantasy, but it's not like high fantasy. It's not sword and sorcery fantasy. He's like a meta temple detective, and there's all stories about that. That one is considered really, really good. And then there's other stories that he's written which are not fantasy stories. These are the ones he's written these more recently. Like these are the more recent stories. Like within the past several years, he's been going more into various different stories. And even though he did some Elric story continuations of Elric, which is the character, but he's not really in the same fantasy world. He's more of like a different kind of world. It's completely different, and I don't feel like it's really true to the original Elric character and the original Elric stories. But you know, he did write those, and he's a good writer, so that's something that is I didn't resonate with those stories, but I do like his writings, and I think whatever he writes is like significant, and it's good. So there's that. There's those stories, which are the high fantasy stories, and then there's like Jerry Cornelius, which is like not like it's fantasy, but it's not like sword and sorcery fantasy. And there's other stories, and the recent ones that I've seen, he's just been doing books which are completely not fantasy, which are just completely like fiction and stuff like that, as far as I know, because I haven't read those books. But looking at the books, they did not look fantasy to me. It wasn't like, when you read it, it's like, okay, this is fiction. When you read the back of it to see what it's about, when you read the back of the novel, it says like, okay, that sounds like it's fiction, and it's not like a fantasy. So I haven't read it because I'm into his fantasy stuff. And because I read some of his newer Elric things, which were not as fantasy as I would have, as the older Elrics, and as I would have liked, it's still, so I kind of more like, just based on what I've read, his fantasy stuff. So I really haven't read the non-fantasy other things, but he writes a whole bunch of other stuff. So give it a shot. I mean, if you like his writings, if you read any of his books, and you like how they're written, and you like, the way he's written, or any of other stories, check out some of his other stories. He's got other stories. If you're not into fantasy, he's got like a bunch of other stuff that he's done, which are just not fantasy. But in my opinion, his best stuff is his fantasy stuff. His Elric of Melnibone, his Eternal Champion, all of that stuff was really good. And yeah, Chronicles of Quorum is really, really good, and the Runestaff series is really good. So those series, those are like the number one thing that I would recommend you guys like check out. So let me know in the comments what you think, and like and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys later. Take care. Hey.